The Council Hall of Unified Species floated at the heart of the Ashara binary system, a web of interlocking platforms suspended in the space between two suns. For 300 cycles, it had been a place of diplomacy, trade, and meticulously worded treaties. Today it smelled of fear. Chancellor Vora's limb, a delicate manipulator composed of softly pulsing light, trembled as she gestured toward the central hologram. The image showed a vast ring-shaped construct, the tether orbiting the smaller of the two stars, a web of energy conduits, gravity stabilizers, and technology so old that no living species could trace its origin. The tether was failing. Its ancient harmonics were slipping, and if the star's orbit destabilized, the entire planetary cradle would tear itself apart. Billions of souls, extinction in a mathematical certainty. The finest quantum artisans of the Zalari Heg, the Council's most advanced engineers, had spent 40 cycles trying to repair it. They had recalculated the phase variances, attempted to reinitialize the exotic matter matrices, and failed utterly. Every intervention only accelerated the decay. In the curved rows of ambassadors, humanity's representatives sat with an unsettling stillness. Ambassador Samantha Hayes was a tall woman with short silver-streaked hair and a face that seemed to hold a permanent, quiet amusement. She wore the simple dark uniform of Earth's diplomatic corps, no medals, no ceremonial sashes. Many species found humans disconcerting, not threatening in the physical sense, but in the way they smiled when everyone else was panicking. Vora's translator emitted a soft, mournful chime. Ambassador Hayes, the Council has exhausted its knowledge. We understand your species has demonstrated unusual technical aptitude. We formally request that Earth provide engineers to stabilize the tether. Lives uncounted depend upon this. Hayes rose, her smile not quite reaching the corners of her eyes, a subtle expression that a Zalari would never decode. She touched her comm badge and spoke 4 words. Send the response. We'll have our top team deployed immediately. A current of relief rippled through the chamber. The Zalari artificer caste envisioned scientific prodigies fluent in multidimensional physics, architects of theoretical frameworks that might bridge the gaps in their own understanding. They assumed Earth would send its finest minds, the ones who had reversed climate collapse on their homeworld with fusion infrastructures and atmospheric scrubbers that bordered on magic. Hayes sat down, folded her hands, and waited. 3 hours later, the shuttle beacon at the tether station pinged an incoming vessel. High Artificer Valen, a Zalari whose body was a tall, thin assembly of segmented ceramic-like plates, floated to the viewing port. His ocular band adjusted focus, expecting a sleek craft of polished composite, humming with contained intellect. Instead, he watched a ship that looked as though it had been assembled from scrap metal and stubbornness. Dents marred its hull. A section of plating near the cargo door was a different color than the rest, clearly patched. Some sort of emblem was painted on the side. A stylized gear crossed with a lightning bolt, and the words, "We fix stuff." The docking clamps engaged with a sound like a filing cabinet being kicked shut. Valen's translation of the incident report later would include the phrase, a profound sense of impending cultural dissonance. The cargo ramp lowered, atmosphere equalized, and from inside the freighter, a voice called out in a dialect the translators rendered as country standard. "All right, y'all, let's see what's broke." Part 2. High Artificer Valen had trained for 60 cycles to master the intricacies of dimensional stabilization. He had received accolades from 7 systems for his thesis on exotic matter hysteresis. Yet nothing in his experience had prepared him for the 4 humans who walked down that ramp. The first was a male of indeterminate age, his face a roadmap of weather and high-G welding scars. He wore coveralls with the sleeves ripped off, revealing arms corded with dense muscle and a network of faded tattoos. 2 fingers on his left hand were missing, replaced by rugged mechanical digits that clicked when he flexed them. A heavy crescent wrench hung from his belt, polished by decades of use. His name was stitched on his chest, Jeb. Behind him came a giant. The second human was taller than any Zalari Valen had encountered, with a barrel chest and hands that could palm a reactor housing. A bandana held back wild black hair. He carried a toolbox the size of a small vehicle, handle gripped loosely, as if it weighed nothing. The stitching on his coveralls read Bubba. The third was lean and jittery, constantly chewing on a stick of some fibrous substance, eyes darting across the station's architecture like a crow assessing shiny objects. His pockets bulged with rolls of tape, wire snips, and a device that resembled a heat gun. He was Skeeter. The fourth was a female, perhaps a quarter shorter than Jeb, with a weathered cap pulled low and a welding rig slung across her back like a weapon. She carried the faint scent of ozone and machine oil. Her nameplate said Erling. Valen's translator stammered as he stepped forward. On behalf of the council, I extend greetings. We were informed Earth would be sending its foremost engineers. Jeb looked past him, scanning the flickering corridor lights and the faint vibration running through the deck plates. We're engineers. Forgive my directness, but your appearance suggests manual labor. Valen's plates tightened, a Zalari gesture of polite disbelief. The tether requires quantum recalibration at a submaterial level. We requested scientists. Jeb unhooked the wrench from his belt, holding it up so the light caught its worn metal. This here's my engineering degree. Earned it rebuildin' hydroelectric dams after the Ohio quake, fixin' orbital rigs with vacuum-rated baling wire, and coaxin' fusion reactors that hadn't run in 60 years to fire up again. Don't need a lab coat to know when a machine's hurtin'. Erling stepped forward, her voice gravelly and calm. Listen, tall fella, you got a thing that spins, burns, or holds pressure, we can fix it. If it's quantum, that just means the parts are real small and real stubborn. We're okay with stubborn. Valen felt the equivalent of a headache forming. The council's gamble had produced not the intellectual saviors he had imagined, but a crew of vocal, physically imposing tinkerers who carried their tools like extensions of their bodies. Yet the evacuation clock was already ticking. The station's core shuddered, a deep, stomach-lurching tremor that made the deck plates groan. Jeb caught Bubba's eye. Feel that. Same sound a busted transfer case makes when the bearings are shot. He turned back to Valen. We gonna stand here jowin' about credentials, or you gonna show us the sick patient? Without waiting for an answer, Jeb strode past Valen into the main corridor, his crew falling in behind him. Skeeter tapped the wall with his knuckles, listening. Erling ran a hand over a coolant pipe, gauging its temperature with a frown. Bubba hummed a low, off-key tune. Valen hurried to keep pace, his ceramic plates rattling with indignation. The core nexus is 300 meters inward. Please do not touch any. Relax, Shiny, Jeb said over his shoulder. We ain't gonna break nothing that ain't already broken. The corridor opened into a vast chamber where the tether's ancient heart pulsed with erratic, angry light. Jeb stopped, planted his hands on his hips, and let out a long, admiring whistle. Hell, I've seen tractors in worse shape. Part 3. The core nexus defied easy description. Imagine a cathedral built of frozen lightning and weeping mathematics, and you might approach a fraction of its strangeness. The tether was not merely a machine. It was a wound in the fabric of physics, stitched closed by a civilization that had vanished before the Zalari learned to write. Its surfaces flowed and refracted in ways that hurt the eyes. Tendrils of unstable plasma crawled along its conduits like searching fingers. Valen gestured with a slender appendage toward the central manifold, a pulsating knot of what looked like liquid glass. The exotic matter matrix has entered a degenerative phase cycle. It requires synchronization across 7-dimensional layers simultaneously. Our recrystallization equations can't account for the chaotic feedback introducing. Hold up, Jeb held out a hand, palm forward. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a small tin, and extracted a pinch of something dark and fibrous. He tucked it into his cheek. Then he pointed at the manifold. Y'all see that flicker right there, the little shudder every 3 seconds. Skeeter crouched, pulling out a device that was unmistakably a thermal camera duct taped to a consumer-grade phone. Gettin' a heat spike on the lower quadrant. That ain't chaotic feedback. That's a stuck check valve causing back pressure. It's feedin' right back into the intake loop and chockin' the whole system. Valen's plates flared. There are no valves in an exotic matter conduit. The flow is regulated by probability harmonics. Erling unrolled a length of thick silver tape that seemed to shimmer with embedded metallic fibers. Sure, there's a valve. Might be made of ghost glass and quantum what's-it, but it's still a thing that's supposed to open and close. It ain't Clausen. So we bypass it, install a shunt, and run a coolant line from your secondary reactor to keep the temperature stable. The Zalari's translator crackled with the effort of conveying his outrage. A bypass would fracture the containment field. The resulting cascade would vaporize this station and the star itself. You are proposing to reroute forces that could unmake local spacetime with a shunt and tape. Jeb spat into a small disposable cup he'd conjured from somewhere. Ma'am, you ever reroute a force that could unmake local spacetime? He asked Erling. Once, back on Luna, the old Heinlein array tried to shake itself apart during a magnetosphere test. We bypassed the main coil with a refrigerated bus bar and a prayer. Held fine. Valen turned to the comms array, transmitting directly to the council. The hologram of Chancellor Vora shimmered into existence, her light body dim with worry. The human team's methodology is incompatible with the tether's design. They intend to perform invasive modifications. Hayes's voice, calm and unhurried, came through the channel. Artificer Valen, what's the alternative? Evacuate Ashara and watch the system die. Give them access. The council will not stand in the way of a repair, however unorthodox. The station shuddered again, harder this time. A deep groan resonated through the chamber, and one of the observation galleries flickered and went dark. Valen checked the timer. 3 hours until the tether's orbit decayed beyond recovery. The evacuation fleet was already burning toward the outermost colony. No more time for debate. You have a single rotation cycle, Valen said, his voice heavy. If the feedback crosses threshold, I will trigger the emergency containment purge personally. Skeeter grinned. Plenty of time, long as nobody micromanages. Jeb cracked his knuckles, both flesh and mechanical. All right, crew, let's make this bird sing. Bubba, get the heavy liftin'. Skeeter, find me a power tap I ain't afraid of. Erling, he nodded toward the manifold. You're on SEAL duty. Erling pulled the welding rig off her back and lowered her goggles. The torch flared blue. Time to get messy. Part 4. The next hour became a symphony of controlled chaos. Valen stood at the chamber's edge, recording everything, his ceramic plates oscillating between horror and a strange, unwilling fascination. Jeb attacked the manifold's lower access panel with a crowbar-like tool he called a persuader. The panel, which Zalari technicians had spent 3 cycles trying to remove without damaging, popped free in under a minute. Jeb tossed it aside with a clatter that made Valen flinch. Factory spec. Snug fit. Inside, the conduit resembled a coiled serpent of solid light, pulsing with ominous brilliance. Jeb reached in with his bare hand, the mechanical fingers clicking, and felt along the glowing surface. Valen's warning died in his throat as he realized the human's artificial digits were insulated with some material that didn't conduct the exotic energy. Jeb found a juncture, traced it, and nodded. There it is. The return valve fused open. Skeeter, you got that bypass diagram. Skeeter was already sketching on a wall panel with a grease pencil. The diagram looked like a child's drawing of a plumbing system, all jagged lines and circles. Right here, Jeb. We tap the primary feed before the blockage, route it through the station's galley coolant pump, Bubba already pulled it, and dump the excess heat into the secondary reactor's thermal sink. The pump can handle the pressure if we reinforce the impeller with that carbide mesh I found in maintenance. You intend to pump an exotic matter stream through a kitchen appliance, Valen said. It's a very good pump, Skeeter replied. Industrial grade, stainless housing, they don't make them like that anymore. Bubba returned carrying the pump assembly under one arm and a coil of heavy cable in the other. He set the pump down with surprising gentleness and began stripping the cable with his teeth. Valen made a note to study human dentition. Erling was already welding a makeshift bracket onto the side of the manifold, sparks cascading in a curtain of white-hot rain. She worked with a speed that suggested decades of practice. Her welds smooth and uniform despite the shaking deck. "Bubba, I need that bracket held steady. Get in there." Bubba wedged himself between two conduits that were actively carrying rivers of plasma, his bulk absorbing the vibration. He pressed the bracket into place with one hand, the other resting on a support beam. The proximity alarm screamed for 3 seconds before Skeeter shut them off with a well-placed smack to the console. "These safeties are wound way too tight," Skeeter muttered. "Machine can't breathe." Valen transmitted another update to the council. "The humans have disconnected 17 interlock systems. They are currently using a maintenance drone's power cell to run a diagnostic loop. One of them is inside the manifold." Vora's response was delayed, filled with the crackle of a strained connection. "Can they succeed?" "I do not know. They are either brilliant or pathologically reckless, possibly both." Skeeter called out from the manifold's open hatch. "Bypass line is ready. Give me flow control, Jeb." Jeb positioned himself at the primary feed junction, a massive wheel-shaped regulator that had not been turned in millennia. He planted his feet, gripped the wheel with both hands, and strained. The metal screamed. The wheel moved a fraction, then another fraction. Then it spun free, and the entire station lurched as a surge of power blasted through the new route. For one breathless moment, the lights stabilized. The tether's hum shifted from a discordant wail to a smooth, deep thrum. Erling lifted her welding goggles. "That's it. It's running." Then the bulkhead behind them erupted. A jet of superheated atmosphere tore through the chamber wall, ripped open by a feedback surge that the bypass had inadvertently amplified. Emergency shields failed to trigger. The pressure wave threw Erling and Skeeter to the deck. Jeb grabbed a handhold, screaming over the roar of escaping air. Bubba braced himself, but the section was sealing off, a blast door sliding shut, trapping the 4 humans in the rapidly depressurizing compartment. Valen, on the other side, slammed his appendage against the override. The door was jammed. The humans were cut off, oxygen bleeding into vacuum with no way out. Part 5. Inside the sealed compartment, the roar of escaping atmosphere dwindled as the pressure equalized with the void outside. The emergency bulkhead had done its job too well. The humans were now entombed in a corridor lit only by flickering crimson emergency strips. A thin curtain of frost was already forming on the surfaces. Erling was the first to move. She crawled to the breach, a jagged gash 3 meters long, and assessed. "We got about 6 minutes of breathable air left. Skeeter, give me that sealant." Skeeter tossed the roll of tape and a canister of expanding sealant compound. Erling grabbed a cafeteria table that had been bolted to the wall before the explosion, ripped it free with a grunt, and pressed it over the largest portion of the tier. "Bubba, hold this. Jeb, get the regulator from that fire extinguisher. We need to pressurize the patch." While Bubba applied his mass to the table, Skeeter worked the sealant around the edges, the compound foaming and hardening almost instantly in the vacuum. Jeb wrenched the extinguisher off the wall, removed the valve assembly, and began improvising a pressure feed. His mechanical fingers moved with delicate precision, adjusting the flow rate. "This'll buy us a few minutes. Won't hold forever." Valen's voice came through the helmet comm Jeb had donned earlier. "Humans, can you hear me? The blast door is fused. We are attempting to cut through from the other side, but the metal has warped into a solid mass." Jeb keyed the comm. "Don't bother. We're not coming out until the bypass is stable. The surge that blew the bulkhead means we got back pressure somewhere. If we don't fix it, the whole tether'll shake apart. You have minutes of air, and you wish to continue the repair." "Buddy," Jeb said, his voice eerily calm, "a machine ain't dead till it's cold, and this one's still running hot." On the council channel, Valen's transmission carried a note of something approaching panic, an emotion Zalari rarely experienced. "Chancellor, the humans are refusing extraction. They have sealed themselves in a dying compartment and are continuing the modification." Vora's light pulsed with conflicting colors. "Can they complete the repair?" "The odds are incalculable." Ambassador Hayes's voice cut through the channel. Then calculate them faster, because those four have survived reactor breaches, hull collapses, and a fuel air explosion on Titan. They don't know how to quit. Inside the compartment, Erling had the patch holding. The pressure was low but breathable. Skeeter had rigged a secondary monitor from a handheld scanner, and the readings were grim. The bypass was working, but the exotic matter flow was oscillating, a rhythmic surge that was feeding back into the manifold's control lattice. Every oscillation grew stronger. "It's hitting a harmonic," Skeeter said, rubbing his jaw. "Like a washing machine with an uneven load. The whole station's gonna start dancing if we don't dampen it." Jeb studied the trembling conduits. He could feel the vibration through the deck, a low thrum that rattled his teeth. "We need mass, something heavy enough to absorb the shake and flexible enough to not snap. Bubba, what's the heaviest thing in this section that ain't bolted to a star?" Bubba looked around, then pointed at a stack of reactor shielding crates near the far wall. Each crate weighed several hundred kilograms, filled with dense composite plates. "Those'll do." "Get 'em, Skeeter, find me a lever. Erling, I need a cantilever beam. That support strut you welded earlier might work." Jeb's voice was steady, unhurried, as if he were fixing a grain conveyor on a hot afternoon. Valen listened to the chatter, his translator struggling with the colloquialisms. He could hear the humans breathing, growing heavier as the oxygen thinned. He could hear the clatter of tools, the grunts of effort, the sizzle of Erling's torch. And he could hear, beneath it all, the rising whine of the tether's core, a sound that promised total structural failure within the hour. "They're going to die in there," Valen said softly, not realizing his channel was still open. Erling's voice answered, rough but unafraid. "Honey, the day I die's gonna be when I'm too old to hold a wrench. Today ain't that day." Part 6. Jeb's plan came together in frantic, oxygen-starved bursts. They dragged the crate of shielding plates across the buckled deck, Bubba moving it almost alone, his boots gouging tracks in the metal. Skeeter found a length of Durasteel support beam and wedged it under a fixed structural rib, creating a lever point that jutted into the compartment like a springboard. Erling tack-welded the beam's base, then stood back. Chest heaving. "We mount the crate on the free end of the cantilever," Jeb explained, his words coming faster now, "and angle it so the beam presses against the main conduit housing. When the vibration spikes, the beam flexes and the weight absorbs the energy, like a shock absorber on a pickup truck." Skeeter was already lashing the crate to the beam with cargo straps. The rhythmic oscillation was growing violent. The deck plates were starting to buckle upward, then slam back down in a drumbeat of destruction. Jeb knew they had maybe 2 minutes before the tether's superstructure tore itself free from its own moorings. "Get it in place," he shouted. Bubba and Skeeter heaved the cantilever assembly forward, wedging the weighted end firmly against the shuddering conduit housing. Erling lit her torch and welded the pivot bracket in 3 spots, the blue arc hissing in the thin air. Jeb grabbed a heavy sledgehammer from the pile of tools and sighted along the conduit. "Skeeter, you see that valve stem on the auxiliary return line, the one that's shacking like a rattlesnake?" "Yeah, I see it." "I need you to drive a wedge in there. Not all the way, just enough to constrict the flow by about 30%. That'll reduce the pulse amplitude." Skeeter pulled a tapered steel drift from his belt, positioned it against the valve assembly, and swung a smaller mallet. The wedge bit. The valve stem, vibration dropped by a visible margin, but the oscillation was still building elsewhere, a shifting pressure wave that now hammered against the cantilever. The station screamed. Deck plates tore loose, spiraling past the patch and out into the void. Jeb's ears popped. The temperature dropped another 10 degrees. Bubba wrapped his arms around the crate, holding it steady with raw strength while the beam flexed and bounced. "Now what?" Skeeter yelled. "We wait," Jeb yelled back. "It's gotta find equilibrium." For 10 endless seconds, the chamber shook so violently that the humans could barely stay upright. Erling rose, fell again. Skeeter grabbed a dangling conduit for support and was nearly shaken loose. Jeb watched the cantilever's tip, the crate bouncing like a metronome on amphetamines, and willed it to hold. He thought about a dam in Kentucky, a flood that had nearly swept his hometown away, and the way his father had braced the spillway gates with railroad ties until the waters crested. Same principle, mass against motion. The conduit housing groaned, a deep, agonized sound. Then the rhythm began to break. The shocks became erratic, losing their destructive coherence. The crate absorbed one spike, then another and another, the beam bending to its structural limit without snapping. The oscillation flattened into a rough, rumbling idle. The tether's core, visible through a cracked monitor screen, stabilized. The exotic matter flow smoothed. The failing orbit arrested. Silence fell. Not total silence. There was still the hiss of the patch, the thin whine of emergency systems, but the bone-shaking vibration was gone. The station was holding. Valen's voice returned, disbelieving. The readings are stable. The harmonic feedback has been damped. How did you accomplish that? Jeb leaned against the bulkhead, wiping sweat and frost from his brow with a shaking hand. His mechanical fingers clicked softly. He looked at the jury-rigged cantilever, the crate still quivering gently as it absorbed residual pulses. A laugh, hoarse, exhausted, escaped his lips. Didn't know it'd work, but it felt heavy enough. Part 7. The tether held. Across the Ashara system, the evacuation sirens fell silent. Families huddled in shelters watched the emergency lights dim and felt the ground stop trembling. On the station, emergency crews cut through the fused blast door an hour later, expecting to recover bodies. They found 4 humans sitting on the deck, sharing a canteen of lukewarm water and debating the best way to season the Zalari galley's protein rations. Valen entered the compartment, his ceramic plates dull with exhaustion, and stood before Jeb without speaking for a long moment. The human looked up, spat into his ever-present cup, and raised an eyebrow. You gonna stand there, or you gonna thank us proper? The High Artificer did something no Zalari had done in living memory. He bent one of his rigid limbs in an approximate bow. The Council of Unified Species extends its gratitude. You have preserved billions of lives with methods I still do not fully comprehend. Methods, Erling said, stowing her welding rig, are just experience dressed up in dirt and grease. Y'all got plenty of science. You forgot how to listen to the machine. 2 cycles later, the council reconvened in full session. This time, the chamber was not filled with fear but with a strange, humming curiosity. Ambassador Hayes stood in the central dais, and beside her, in the same stained coveralls they'd worn throughout the crisis, were Jeb, Bubba, Skeeter, and Erling. The Zalari Chancellor's light body shone with warm, approving colors. Your species has demonstrated an aptitude that defies our classification systems, Vora said. We requested engineers. You sent something else. Something we lack the framework to name. What are you? Jeb scratched the back of his neck. Ma'am, we're just folks who like fixin' things. Don't matter if it's a tractor engine or a dimensional stabilizer. A machine's a machine. It'll tell you what's wrong if you're willing to listen and stubborn enough to stay put when it gets hard. The Chancellor offered them official posts as master engineers of the Council, with laboratories, research staff, and resources beyond imagination. Erling shook her head. Appreciate it, but we ain't lab types. We just clutter up your fancy hallways with grease stains. Bubba spoke for the first time in the chamber, his voice a low rumble. We'll come back if something else breaks. A ripple of something like laughter moved through the assembled dignitaries. Vora inclined her head. Then I shall hope something breaks often. Skeeter raised a hand. One thing, though, our ship's air conditioner's been making a noise like a bag of wrenches in a blender. If one of your techs could take a look. The Council's translation algorithm needed 3 full seconds to render that into Zalari, and when it did, the chamber echoed with the strange, chittering sound of alien amusement. As the freighter departed Ashara, its patched hull glinting in the binary starlight, Ambassador Hayes stood at the observation window and allowed herself a quiet smile. On the station below, Zalari engineers were already examining the humans' modifications, not to dismantle them, but to study them. One enterprising young artificer had requested a shipment of Earth-made duct tape through the trade channels. The order had been approved within the hour. The freighter's pilot, a retired cargo hauler named Mitch, who hadn't even left the cockpit during the whole affair, asked Jeb over the intercom where they were headed next. "Set a course for the outer arm relay station," Jeb said, settling into his seat and propping his boots on the console. "Heard their FTL comm relay's been actin' up, probably just a loose coupling." He pulled out his wrench, checked its weight, and tucked it back into his belt. Somewhere in the vast machinery of the galaxy, another call for help was waiting, and humanity, grinning and grease-stained, was already on the way.